beautiful community present. Oh, we can start. Is more mobilization needed by the tyrant in the Kremlin? And is he going to do that? And how will the Russian people react? It's something that I feel a lot of questions are coming up about again. And we're a year in since Putin's quote-unquote partial mobilization a year ago, of course. So let's put a couple of more political words. If you want military analysis, of course, please go to appropriate sources. I'm not one. The mobilization is, of course, going on as we speak in a crawling, sprawling way. And a lot of people are being scooped up and scooped up against their will too. But we may see a wave. It may be more dispersed than what we might expect when it comes, but we may see it, and the question is when and what are going to be the consequences. It's reasonable to expect it. Now, they're going to have an October military call-up in Russia, which means they can't do that together with the mobilization very easily at all. Presumably that means, although I don't know, but presumably that means that if they do a mobilization, that they will have to do one after that, perhaps early in to 2024. So let's sort of make a few basic political points about this. One is that what the Russian state is doing now, the Putin regime is doing now, is killing as improvisation in the name of utopia. The utopia being the restoration of some kind of a shape for the Russian Empire that is adequate to its historical bullshit mission. You could conceivably come up with a less utopian story and say that if we strip the mystical elements away, which I don't think you can do actually, what they're looking for is something like weakening West, democratic depletion in the West, weakening of support for Ukraine, and then some kind of challenge to NATO from which NATO runs away in 2029. So that's the more prosaic version of the mystical story of Russia coming from the back row of nations to some kind of a frontal position. They wanted to do their coup-like war, or warlike coup, in 2022 Feb. It failed. And ever since then, they've been improvising. They have an idea of where they want to end up. They're ever more committed to ending up there, so they've not weakened their dedication to where they want to get. That's certainly true of Mr. Putin. And it's probably true of whoever it is Putin talked with in the months and indeed years running up to the invasion. His conversations with Mr. Kovalchuk in pandemic isolation may have played a role here. It'll be interesting historically to find out what that role was. But the commitment is as strong as ever to these both incoherent utopian mystical goals and to the more prosaic version of that goal, which is some kind of a forced dissolution of NATO as an effective global entity in 2028. But once that coup story failed in February 2022, they have gone on to improvise. And their improvisation is the delightful stuff we've seen in Ukraine ever since. Now, they will carry that improvisation on until they find gaps, until they find holes to reach for these either mystical or more prosaic goals, the utopian goal or the unlikely sort of punch at NATO, which breaks it. Until they find these holes and try to reach through them, and they might misread these holes, they might think that they're there when they're not. They have these dogmatic views about the inexorable decline of our democracies, which is in reality a much more contingent enterprise. But they're improvising until they get there, and obviously, putting it very bluntly, their preferred mode of improvisation is making life hell for Ukrainians. Their foreign policy is action and improvisation, and the actions that make sense are the actions they're engaging in. Now, the technology of improvisation, technology of mobilization has changed, and we won't get into the technical details of this. We've discussed this several times. It is not my expertise, but they're quite unlikely to make it smooth, knowing that track record, but the aspiration has been to bring it about that if and when mobilization is needed, their capacity to reach for people and grasp them is much more straightforward than the huge trouble they had months and months ago. Now, a word on the first mobilization. I think the sense that Russia experts have is that it was a big shock that nevertheless got absorbed quite quickly and quite well. It was a shock for Putin, of course, that it was such a shock for the Russian people, I guess. Perhaps not as much as the Prigozhin mutiny was a shock for Putin, but a shock. And the story of how the shock subsided is that a certain number of people got scooped up, and the sense was that others are relatively safe for the time being, and then there's a possibility to relax. And there's a very interesting feature of this that one of the good Russia experts, Kirill Rogov, has been talking about recently, and it's worth analyzing its political implications, and that's that the preferred policy of the Putin regime is to take these mobilized folks and keep them there, basically, until they survive or die, but keep them there without rotating. And that has been, to an extent, reassuring to the population, because the fact that Ricky number one isn't coming back makes Ricky number two, who hasn't been mobilized, feel safer. And that's a real illustration of how profoundly political many of these military decisions that Russia is taking are. So it presumably makes a lot of sense to rotate these mobilized folks, get some new ones, give these ones a break, or let them just call it a day. But that would disturb the depoliticized blob in the middle. And there's already a palpable sense of disquiet by families of mobilized about folks not being rotated, about people not coming back. And they're being shut down when they complain. Don't complain about the war. They just say, let's have a war with rotation. Bring our boy back, send another one. Why is he why is he not being rotated? And that's just an expression of the age-old conversation we've had on the main channel here for well over a year about balancing Putin's need to keep people on the couch with his need to send them to the front. And that is a balancing act that is all the more delicate and precarious as the Putin regime moves toward the 2024 election. And you might think, well, what election? And you'd be right, but the problem is that perceived legitimacy in Russia is the perceived legitimacy of the Putin regime, the perceived legitimacy of Putin as a political institution, and he has that political perceived legitimacy still, is predicated on what experts call a kind of process of acclimation. So the point isn't that they support particular policies, that Russian people support particular policies, but that whatever policies are done, there's a ritual that allows the story to float that the leader who does these policies has the backing of a significant chunk of the population. So the election is a kind of a process of acclimation. Here goes the monarch. The monarch is doing various things. He's done this policy. He's done that policy. He started a disastrous war. He might have done something different. He might have, in fact, made concessions to Ukraine instead of starting a war against Ukraine. But the point is, whatever he does, there's a kind of a ritual which makes it look like the population accepts it. And that way he can operate with the idea that he has the masses behind him. Not behind his policies, but behind whatever he does. And that still matters. And so it's catastrophic for Mr. Putin if the election goes unsmoothly, very unsmoothly. And there's the appearance that people are not buying into this kind of deal of outsourcing politics to him. So that's why all of this is even more sensitive, and it's a precarious political balance between mobilization and depoliticization that the regime will continue trying to play with over the months to come, and we'll keep talking about it lots of left.